Hey all, this is Professor Tracy from Law Simply Explained, back with another lesson, this one on acceptance, and we're going to also look at other possible responses to an offer. And so let's take a look right away here with what we're going to cover in this lesson. We're first going to do some review, as we often do. Then we're going to look at what an acceptance is and how it functions. Then we're going to look at terminating the power of acceptance. We're going to look at silence as acceptance. And then we're going to look at acceptance by mail or through the mailbox. So there's a lot of ground to cover. Let's jump into the review. With review, remember that we started by looking at what is a promise. We said that a promise was a manifestation, an outward expression of words or conduct, and it's of an intention, meaning that I intend to do something, I will do something, and with a promise, it's I'm going to act or refrain from acting in a specified way. And as we've been saying in the last couple of lessons, that a promise, just like when we looked at mutual assent and we looked at offer, we're judging it using the objective theory of contracts. So we're asking, would a reasonable person in the shoes of the promisee understand the manifestation, that is the ordinary, giving the words the ordinary meaning, giving any technical words their technical meaning, and then looking at all the surrounding facts and circumstances. Would that reasonable person think that this manifestation was of an intention to act or refrain from acting in a specified way? If the answer is yes, then we can conclude that yes, the promisee is justified in understanding this manifestation as a commitment. Remember that a promise is the basic building block of a contract, and that has been our focus in the first of many lessons. So we said, though, how do we determine whether or not a promise is enforceable? And what we mean by enforceable in this case is that the person to whom the promise is made is able to run into court to seek enforcement of it, to seek a remedy if the person does not follow through on their promise. And we said that if a promise is gratuitous, meaning that it's without consideration, that there's nothing given in exchange for it, there's no consideration given for it, then we said the general rule is no, it's not enforceable unless it falls into one of a handful of exceptions that we looked at. And we said that these exceptions are these four of an executed gift, promissory estoppel, restitution, and promissory restitution. And so remember, when we say an executed gift, the fact that a promise of a gift may have been gratuitous when the promise was made. If the gift has already been given, then the fact that it was gratuitous, the promise of the gift was gratuitous when it was made, is now irrelevant because the gift has been fully executed. We said that promissory estoppel provides another avenue for enforcing a gratuitous promise. That is, that a promisee may make the equitable argument that they have detrimentally relied on the promissor's promise. And remember our elements there, that the promisor must make a promise and that the promisee must rely on that promise. And we ask, can we say, but for the promisor's promise, would the promisee have acted or refrained from acting in the way that she did? And then we ask, was that reliance foreseeable or reasonably expected by the promisor when she made her promise? And then we ask, was it detrimental? Was that reliance detrimental to the promisee? In other words, in that case, we mean, was she harmed by relying on it? And if so, then we would say justice requires the enforcement of that promise, and then there will be a remedy. And we said under the restatement, Section 90, that remedy could either be the full value of the promise, which we would call expectation damages, or what we refer to as reliance damages, which means that we would limit the remedy from the full value of the promise to only what was expended, the amounts of money expended in reliance on that promise. So whatever amounts the promisee expended and relying on it, those would be what would be recovered under a reliance recovery. We said that restitution, or in this case, I mean a quasi-contract or implied-in-law contract, allows someone to recover even in the absence of a promise altogether, because the recovery is based on the value of the benefit that the plaintiff bestowed on the defendant. We ask, one, whether the plaintiff bestowed a benefit on the defendant. Two, did the defendant have knowledge that the plaintiff bestowed that benefit? And three, we say, did they accept that benefit such that it would be unjust for them to retain it without compensating the plaintiff for the value of that benefit? So that's what we mean by restitution in this case, standard restitution or quasi-contract or implied-in-law contract. And then we looked at promissory restitution, which we said is an exception to the rule that a gratuitous promise that's based on moral obligation or past consideration is not enforceable, in that there are some instances where we would allow a promisee to recover in a situation where there would not be consideration, assuming that the promisee bestowed a benefit on the promisor, that the promisor was making the promise in recognition of that benefit, and that it would be unjust to not enforce the promise and to allow the promisor to retain that benefit. And we said that, well, what do we mean it would be unjust or justice requires the enforcement of the promise? We said that the benefit must be substantial and definite. And we then said that other things the restatement suggests we look at to say, does justice require the enforcement, would be, has the promisor already begun to perform what was promised, or has the promisee relied in some way on that promise made by the promisor? And then we're going to look at how formal was the promise. And those are factors, not elements, but we weigh those out and decide, does justice require the enforcement of it? And importantly, although the promise will be enforced, it will only be enforced up to the value of the benefit that was bestowed. Now remember that there's also some common law exceptions that kind of sit alongside promissory restitution, which I don't have specifically listed here, but those would be things like the promise to pay a debt barred by the statute of limitations, the promise to pay a debt discharged in bankruptcy, or a promise to pay a debt or an obligation that was incurred by a minor, and then the minor, upon reaching the age of majority, is now making a promise affirming that they will make good on that obligation. Those are all instances where the only consideration is either in the past or moral obligation. So ordinarily we'd say those promises are gratuitous, but the common law has said those promises are nonetheless enforceable. So continuing on, we said gratuitous promises as a general rule are not enforceable because there's no consideration unless they fall into one of the many exceptions we looked at. Then we said if a promise is contractual in nature, meaning that there is consideration being given for it, then yes, it'll be enforceable, but we want to make sure that all the elements of a valid contract are present. So when we think about that, we know that our elements of a contractor offer acceptance and consideration. We started in looking at consideration. We said there are two overarching parts of consideration. It's a bargain for exchange, where part A here, bargain for exchange, gets at the motivation of the parties. So in other words, was the promisor motivated? Did they make the promise and then motivate a detriment from the promisee? And so then the flip side of that is, was that detriment that was induced by the promisee, is that what motivated the promisor to make her promise in the first place? And we said we need both parts of that to have a bargain for exchange. And we said that that which is being exchanged must be of legal value, which is typically defined under the restatement and a lot of state law, depending on which state you're in, as being either something of benefit to the promisor or something that is a detriment to the promisee. Now remember here, when we say detriment, it's not what we mean. It's not given the same meaning as it is in the context of something like promissory estoppel. Here, what we mean by detriment is that it is something that is that the promisee is obligating herself in a way that she was not otherwise obligated, or that she's waiving a right that she otherwise could have exercised. It doesn't have to be harmful. So if you've read Hamer versus Sidway, then you know that, right? That consideration doesn't have to be something harmful to the person. It just has to be a detriment in the sense that it's either that the person is obligating in themselves in a way they weren't otherwise obligated, or that they're waiving a right that they otherwise could have exercised. And so we reviewed a bunch of sub-rules. We looked at conditional gifts, where we said often the promise of a conditional gift does induce a detriment from the promisee, but that detriment is not what motivated the promisor to make the promise in the first place. For instance, if I promise to give you a couch, if you swing by my house after class, then I have made you a promise, and yes, it's induced a detriment of sorts from you, which is you are going to come by my house, which you wouldn't otherwise be obligated to do, but that's not something that's motivating me to promise the couch. I'm just trying to be nice and give it away to someone who may make good use of it. So that's a conditional gift. It's still gratuitous, right? We said that adequacy of consideration is generally not an issue, that we do not look at the relative values of the things being exchanged. However, we said that if there's a gross disparity in the values of the things being exchanged, that should at least raise a red flag in our brains. But keep in mind, even if there's a gross disparity in the values, that does not mean the element of consideration isn't met. It will still be met, but it raises that red flag that suggests maybe there's a defense that applies, because often people do not enter in willingly or with full knowledge into contracts that are completely one-sided. So we'll look at defenses in later lessons, but at least for now, we can put a pin in that and say it should cause us to pause, to have some caution when we're looking at it. But the exception we said exists with adequacy is if the consideration is in fact nominal. If there's nominal consideration, then it is not adequate. But remember why that is. If something is nominal, then we do not believe that the promisor's promise was motivated because they actually desired that nominal consideration. So for instance, if I were to promise you my car, my Honda Fit, in exchange for $5, then you could say, well, that's not only a gross disparity, but it's highly likely that I'm really just trying to make a gift to you, that the consideration, the $5 there, is really a sham. Why? Because although my promise of the car is inducing a very small detriment from you, that detriment is not what is motivating me to promise the car. I really just want to make a gift, and we're just dressing up the gift. That's what makes it nominal, and that's what makes us say, no, that doesn't satisfy the element of consideration. So that's adequacy. We then looked at illusory promises, where we said a promise is not actually a commitment and doesn't satisfy our definition of a promise if the promisor has given herself a way out. So if I say, I will mow your lawn if I feel like it, that's an illusory promise. That's an illusory promise, and I haven't made an actual commitment. So an illusory promise does not satisfy the element of consideration. Also, past consideration does not satisfy the element of consideration. Why? Because the promisor is merely recognizing something that occurred in the past. So if you were to wash my car on Saturday and then I see you Monday in class, and I say, thank you so much for washing my car. That was great. I promised to pay you $30 for doing that. I'm just recognizing something you did in the past. So my promise did not induce you to wash my car. All it's doing is recognizing that. It couldn't possibly have induced it because it already occurred. So that's why the element of consideration isn't met. We said that moral obligation, which could take the form of it's the right thing to do, or it's just, or it's equitable, or out of love for you, or care, or our great friendship, or my fondness for you. None of those things are sufficient to satisfy the element of consideration. And then remember, if somebody has a pre-existing duty, then that does not satisfy the element of consideration, because a promise to do something that someone is already obligated to do isn't a detriment, right? Because they're already obligated to do it. And we said that they could have that pre-existing duty either because they have a contract already with that particular party or some other party that obligates them to undertake whatever performance it is, or it could be that the law already compels them to do whatever it is. In either case, that pre-existing legal duty means that the element of consideration isn't satisfied. So remember, in the last lesson, we looked at what an offer is. We said that an offer has 4 elements, that it requires a manifestation of a present intent, meaning that right now, a desire to enter into a bargain, an exchange, and that bargain has certain indefinite terms. We said the reason that matters is because the offer is establishing the terms of what will become the contract. So the offeror is proposing the bargain and all of its terms, and those terms must be certain indefinite, such that the resulting contract would be certain indefinite enough that a court would be able to determine whether or not one or both of the parties has breached the contract, right? If the terms aren't clear, then the court's not going to be able to determine did they in fact perform or not. So if, for instance, there was a contract and it said something like, this party is going to substantially landscape my yard, well, what does that even mean, right? It's not clear what just saying landscape means, and substantially landscape is even more ambiguous, and a court would not be able to decide whether or not somebody's has done that or not done that. And we said not only does the court have to be able to determine whether or not there's a breach, but also fashion the appropriate remedy. And that's closely related because they have to understand, for instance, what landscaping must be done to understand financially where do the parties expect to be if we're going to give money damages, if there were an order of specific performance, then to know what it is the parties were actually supposed to do. And we said that it must be that this manifestation of a present intent to enter into a bargain that has certain indefinite terms must be made to an identifiable offeree. And we said that doesn't mean they have to be named, but there has to be clear criteria by which we can know when necessary, who the offeree or offerees are. And so, for instance, we said as a general rule, an ad is not an offer because it's made to the general public rather than being made to a particular person, an identifiable person, or some subset of people in which we could say that works. And then we said that it must be reasonable for the offeree to think that, wow, all I have to do is agree to this offer and there would be a contract. And that's, we're going to look at in just a second what acceptance is. But generally, if you have an actual acceptance, that acceptance of the offer creates a contract. And we're going to ask, is it reasonable for the offeree to think that if we look at the manifestation, the outward expression by words or conduct, and we're looking at it and giving the ordinary meaning to the normal words, ordinary words that are used, and we're giving the technical meaning in any technical words and looking at the surrounding facts and circumstances, is it reasonable for the offeree to think that all they have to do is assent or agree and that a contract would result? And we're going to explore that in more detail in just a second. So we're looking now at acceptance. So let's look at the material for this lesson after a fairly lengthy review there. But this is our definition of an acceptance. It is a manifestation of assent to the terms of the offer, the terms thereof, made by the offeree in the manner invited or required by the offer. As we always do, we're going to chunk it, right? We're going to break it up into its constituent parts, into its elements, to say, okay, we need a manifestation of assent. Manifestations used, as it always has been, an outward expression by words or conduct. And this is by assent. And again, we adhere to the objective theory of contracts. So we're going to look at it and say, well, if we give the ordinary words their ordinary meaning and the technical words their technical meaning, look at all the surrounding facts and circumstance, does it look like the offeree, is it reasonable to say that they have assented to the terms of the offer, which is the second element there, right? It's a manifestation of assent or agreement to the terms of the offer, which we've already defined as they need to be certain indefinite terms. And so the manifestation of assent to the terms of the offer, and it must be done in the manner invited or required by the offer or by the offeror. So, but spelled out how it is that they must manifest their assent to the offer. So let's start with, do we have a manifestation of assent? Ahoy, matey, 'tis I, the dread pirate Bob. 'Twas a fine day at sea today. Took a 12-gun brigantine and 10,000 pieces of 8. Herg, we took an 18-gun sloop and 20,000 pieces of 8. Aye, but did you show no mercy? Not a bit. Were you cruel and unusual? The cruelest. Well, me hearties, that was a fine day. Aye, that it was. How about ye help me swab the deck of me ship, and I'll treat ye to some rum at the old tavern. Well, blow me down. I'd love to join me old pal Bob for a drink at the tavern. So him just thinking is not a manifestation of assent. He's thinking in his head, but just like we said with an offer and with mutual assent, it's got to be outwardly expressed. So subjectively thinking in your head is not a manifestation. You are one cheating buccaneer trying to run a rig on old Herman. I'd rather walk the plank than clean your nasty ship. So here, he's not assenting, right? He's rejected. He's saying, I'm not going to do it. So we'd say, no, again, that obviously that's not a manifestation of assent. It's not agreement in any way. How about you treat me to some rum at the tavern and we forget about swabbing the deck? So there, he's trying to change it, right? He's just saying, take me to the tavern. We forget about worrying about cleaning the deck of your ship. So there, he's changing it, right? He's saying, nah, forget about that part. He's changing it. That, again, isn't a manifestation of assent. He wants the benefit without undergoing the pain of doing some work. So, well, now, let me think of here, matey. I don't rightly know. I guess so, maybe. So here, there's this equivocation, right? So just like with an offer where we said that if there's any equivocation, it's not a manifestation of a present intent to enter a bargain. And just so with an acceptance, if there's equivocation, then it's not an acceptance, right? There's not a manifestation of assent. Aye, matey, I'll be right over to help ye swab the deck and join ye for some grog. So here now we have a clear acceptance, right? He's agreeing and saying, yes, I'll come over, help you swab the deck, and yeah, then I'll join you at the tavern. So that is a yes, that's a manifestation of assent. Well, the second, remember our second element is it's got to be assent to the terms of the offer, which we've already established are laid out in the offer in certain indefinite terms. And the key thing to know, at least at common law, is that the mirror image rule is what controls. When we talk about what is a manifestation of assent to the terms of the offer, it must be that it mirrors every term of the offer exactly. And that does not mean that it restates the terms of the offer, but that it's not trying to change those terms or suggests a change, but that it's just assenting completely to the terms that are spelled out in certain indefinite in the offer. So let's look here. Bo, good to see you, old buddy. I heard you're going away next week. I'm looking to make some money. Will you pay me $100 to watch over your sheep Winnie while you're gone?
Sounds good. So I'll pay you $100 to watch over Winnie and my dog Sadie.
So Bo there's changing it, right? He's saying not just my sheep Winnie, but my dog Sadie. And so he's not assenting to the terms of the offer. He's adding something to it. That's not assent, right, to the terms of the offer.
I accept your offer to watch over Winnie next week for $100, provided you also take care of my sweet dog Sadie.
And you might say, well, isn't this identical to what you just did? It is similar, but the point I'm trying to drive home here is he uses the word I accept, and that throws people off, right? This is a conditional acceptance where you're saying I accept provided or on the condition that, and at common law, that doesn't work. And we'll see even under the UCC, a conditional acceptance is not treated as an acceptance, right? So this kind of conditional, expressly conditional acceptance is not a manifestation of assent to the terms of the offer, right? He's trying to change them, and so it doesn't work. It's not an acceptance.
Are you kidding? You watch over Winnie? I don't think so.
So that's just a flat out rejection, right? Where he's saying, no way. So that's clearly not a manifestation of assent to the terms of the offer.
Sounds great. I've been trying to find someone to watch over my Winnie. Thanks, Bob.
And there you have a mirror image, right? Again, he doesn't have to restate the terms that are laid out in the offer, but he's not trying to change them. He's not making some sort of conditional statement about his acceptance. He's not equivocating in any way. He's just clearly assenting to the terms of the offer. It works just fine to satisfy our second element. So it's a manifestation of assent. It's to the terms of the offer. But then we have this term here, this element that says in the manner invited or required by the offer. This one we've got to break apart more because the method that's laid out, the manner or the method that's laid out could be very specified, right? It could be specified or it could be unspecified. So let's first look at specified. And the key thing to remember here, particularly, and this comes up everywhere, but we've said already that the offeror is the master of the offer, meaning one, as we looked at under offers in the previous lesson, that the offer is establishing what the terms of the resulting contract will be. They're the master of that, right? Because they're establishing, saying, here's the bargain, here's the terms, I'm making this proposed bargain to you, and then all that the offeree is doing is assenting, and that there's a resulting contract that has the terms that were spelled out in the offer. But it also means that the manner in which the offer is accepted is going to be either specified or unspecified at the decision of the offeror. So in that sense, they also are the master of their offer. So when we say the manner invited or required, that means two things, right? It means the basic method of acceptance, meaning, and we'll explain what that means, but also whether or not the offer will be accepted by return promise or a return performance. And so what do we mean by method of acceptance here? Well, the offeree, if there is a specified method of acceptance, then the offeree must use that. And by method here, we mean that quite literally. Like, can the offer be accepted by phone call or text message or a fax or by email or by, using the mail or by UPS or FedEx, or you have to show up in person, whatever it means. Do they actually spell out exactly the method that needs to be used? And so just like when we were looking broadly, that the method by which the offer can be accepted can be specified by the offeror or left unspecified. So let's look at what happens when it's specified. So here Bob says, that's right, I'm selling my old lawnmower for $125. Shoot me a text by 5 p.m. tomorrow if you're interested. So the next day at 2:25 p.m., so he's got it, he's within the window, right? But he calls. Bo says,
hey, Bob, I'll take it. I'll pay you $125 for the lawnmower.
So that's not an acceptance, right? Why? Because it's not done in the manner here, not invited, but required by the offer, which he said by return text, not by a return phone call. So it wouldn't be a valid acceptance. So here, continuing that same train of thought, remember it had to be by text and it had to be by 5 p.m. Here, it's almost 11 p.m., so it's well after 5. So Bo's doing it by text, right? Tap, 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 but it's late.
Hi, Bob. I will take the lawnmower for $125. TTYO.
Here, it's still not a manifestation of assent to the terms of the offer in the manner invited or required, right? Here, required, which was by text message by 5 p.m. Here, it's almost 11 when Bo is texting back, so it's not valid, right? It's not a valid acceptance because Bob specified the method by which it had to be accepted, including the time. So what about if it's in the AM here, the next day at 11:08 a.m., Bo is texting now, so he's not calling, he's doing it before 5 p.m., and he's texting and he says,
hi, Bobby, I will buy the lawnmower for $125. Cheers.
So this should work, right? Because it's before the time, but 5 p.m. deadline, and it's by text. So it is in the manner required by Bob's offer that's using that method. So, but sometimes the method is not spelled out. And remember my method, we're still saying, is it text, is it email, etc. So what if it's not clear? There's this rule if it's unspecified, which is an offeree can accept by any manner and by any medium reasonable in the circumstances. So we'd say, well, they can use any method of accepting when it's not specified, assuming it's reasonable. So let's look here. Bob says, that's right, I'm selling my old lawnmower for $125. If you're interested, let me know. So now Bob hasn't said, right? Before it was by 5 p.m. by text. Now it's unspecified. So Bo now decides he's going to mail it back, right? But they were just texting, or here, I guess they were talking by phone, and now he's going to mail it. And he says,
I'd really like to buy Bob's lawnmower. I hope he gets my acceptance soon.
Here, there's kind of this general rule, which is that if the method that was used to make the offer is of a certain speed and response rate, then you want to use one that's at least as fast, right? Either the same or equivalent. Putting it in the mail is probably not reasonable under the circumstances. It may be, you'd have to look at the specific facts, but this probably would not work. And if it were unreasonable, then it wouldn't be in the manner invited. It's not required here, but invited by the offer because it's not reasonable under the circumstances. But what about this? He calls back. He says,
hey, Bob, I'll take it. I'll pay you $125 for the lawnmower.
That works, right? Because remember, it didn't work in our example where it was specified by 5 p.m. by text, but here it was unspecified, and as long as it's reasonable under the circumstances, it's fine. Bob made the offer with the unspecified method of acceptance by phone. He's using the exact same method here by the return, using a return phone call. That works just fine, right? That's a manner that we would consider invited by the offer. It's reasonable. So what if he decides to text? That too would be fine, right? If he says,
Bob, I will buy the lawn mower for $125.
that would work too, because it's just as fast as a phone call, and indeed probably more common in our day and age. So that would work. It's just as fast. There's nothing about the circumstance suggest one or the other. Particularly, remember, it's invited here. And it's left open, unlike the very first example where Bob had specified it, by a particular deadline and a particular method. So we said that manner invited or required not only means the method of acceptance, but it also suggests whether or not the promise or the offeree, can accept by return promise or by return performance, or maybe has a choice of which to do. So that's what we're going to look at now. So this is the other part of what we mean by the manner invited or required when we talk about acceptance. So here it says, in the manner invited or required includes whether the offeror has invited acceptance by the offeree's return promise or performance. So here, again, just like with method, it can be specified or it can be unspecified. Let's look at when it's specified. And the best way to do this is to look at a chart and to break it down. So with a bilateral contract, remember that if it's specified that it must be done by return promise, then how is acceptance done? It's done by return promise. And the contract forms at the exchange of promises, remember, it's when the promises exchange, not when there's performance. And when the contract forms is at the exchange of promise, and we would say that it's executory on both sides. Remember what that means. It's that neither party has executed or performed the duties that were created under the contract, that neither of them have done what it is they promised. So if it specifies by return promise, that creates a bilateral contract. So let's see that. Hey, Bo, I was just walking past your house this morning, and it looks like your lawn could use a good mow. I'm happy to swing by Friday at 3 p.m. and mow it if you pay me $20.
That will be great. I'm happy to pay you $20 to mow my lawn on Friday afternoon.
So here, it's a promise for a promise, right? He's promising to mow the lawn on Friday, and that Bo is agreeing that, yes, I will pay you $20 to do that. The contract forms now, right? It's bilateral. It's a promise for a promise. And there's a formation of a bilateral agreement. What about unilateral? Remember that it's accepted with a unilateral contract by a return performance rather than by a mere promise. And so the offeree is going to perform, and acceptance does not occur until the offeree has fully performed the requested performance. And we said that often with a unilateral contract, it's something like a reward. I've lost my dog. If you find my dog and bring it to me, I'll pay you $500. That is a typical sort of unilateral contract setup. But remember, part of what makes it unilateral is that when it forms, the offeree is already fully performed. So the only one yet to perform is the offeror. So it's executory only on one side. That would be the offeror. So for instance, with the dog example, if you return the dog, then I am the only one who would yet to perform. I would have to pay you the reward, but there's nothing more for you to do when it forms. So let's look at an example. Bo, I'll give you $500 if you walk across the town bridge. So there, he's looking for him to walk across the bridge. He walks across the bridge, and so it's a promise for a performance, that what Bob is looking for is the return performance. And Bo's now walked across the bridge, given his return performance, and so they formed a unilateral contract, and so it's formed, but remember that Bob would still have to pay what he promised Bo for doing what he did. So what if it's unspecified though? We looked at bilateral and unilateral when that's clearly specified, but what if it's not specified? And this is the one you've really got to pay attention to, which is, what does it mean? How is it accepted if it's unspecified? Well, the offeree can say, I will choose to accept by return promise or by return performance. But this is key. They're not choosing whether or not it's going to be a bilateral or a unilateral contract. No, we default to bilateral when it's unspecified. Meaning what? That if the offeree is choosing to accept by performance, then the start of that performance is treated as the return promise, right? So whether or not the offeree chooses to accept by return promise or return performance, it will be a bilateral agreement. It's just that the beginning of the performance, if that's what the offeree chooses to do to accept, would be treated as conduct that is a return promise that creates a bilateral agreement. So it's going to be executory on both sides, just like a bilateral contract. That's probably confusing when you hear it, but let's look at some examples.
Bob, if you will mow my lawn next week, I will pay you $30.
So here's what the restatement says when it's unspecified. It says the offeror is often indifferent as to whether acceptance takes the forms of words of promise or acts of performance, and his words literally referring to one are often intended and understood to refer to either, meaning the offeror really doesn't care. And so for here, if Bob's sitting there going, well, what should I do? What does that mean? Do I give a promise or do I give performance? If it's truly unspecified, and here Bob says, I'll make a return promise, Bo, that sounds great. I'll mow your lawn next week for $30. So we have a promise for a promise. That's a bilateral agreement. It's executory on both sides. So that's just a classic formation of a bilateral contract. But what if he instead chooses performance? This was what I was trying to focus on when we were looking at the chart. When it's unspecified and the offeree here, Bob, chooses to accept by return performance, then when he starts to perform, Bob chose performance, when he began his performance, that is deemed conduct that is treated as a manifestation of assent to the terms of the offer in the manner invited or specified. It's invited here, or mandated or required. It's not, he didn't require one or the other, right? It wasn't specified. And so here we would say that the beginning of Bob's performance here is conduct that was the manifestation. That in and of itself was the promise. So we would say what? The beginning of his performance was a promise. It's still bilateral, and that Bob is obligated to complete that performance. Now we're going to explore bilateral, unilateral more in some of the coming chapters or lessons here. But this here, remember, it's when it's unspecified, the beginning of the performance is deemed to be the return promise. Because if Bo didn't say, I want a return promise or I want return performance, then Bob can choose. But either way, it will be bilateral. So we would treat it as if, remember, it's still going to be treated as a promise for a promise. And so it would be bilateral. It's just that the beginning of the performance is the promise. Now, what about this part, right? We said we're also going to look at terminating the power of acceptance. And how does that work? Well, there's a number of ways in which it could be terminated: by rejection of the offer, by revocation of the offer, by the offeree making a counteroffer, by the lapse of the offer, or by the death of either party. The power of acceptance would be terminated. So let's start with rejection. That's, I think, fairly straightforward, right? It's when the offeree rejects an offer when she communicates to the offeror that she does not intend to accept the offer. And essential here is that it's effective upon notice to the offeror. So let's look at an example. If If you finish that table you've been working on, deliver it to my house tomorrow, I'll give you $500 for it.
No.
That's a clear rejection, right? It's rejected. So, what about a revocation? A revocation is done by the offeror. So, it's the offeree who rejects, it's the offeror who revokes. And the general rule is that an offeror can revoke her offer anytime prior to acceptance. And just like a rejection, it's effective upon notice. But one key thing to know here is that notice could be indirectly, it could come indirectly to the offeree or directly, and it could come through words or actions. So let's look at some examples of revocation.
Bob, I will sell you my 20 acres of farmland for $850,000. I promise to keep my offer open for 30 days.
So one key thing I want to drive home here is remember that promise is gratuitous, right? A promise to keep my offer open for 30 days is just a gratuitous promise. And so Bo's not bound by it unless there's what we'll see in later lessons, unless there's an actual option contract in place, then Bo is not bound by that. So he can come back. He doesn't have to wait the full 30 days. So if he comes back the next day and says,
Bob, I changed my mind. I take back the offer I made to you.
So he's giving notice directly to Bob. And remember, his promise to keep it open for 30 days was merely gratuitous. So he's not bound by it. He can revoke it anytime prior to acceptance. Bob didn't accept, and he's given notice directly to Bob. It's a clear revocation, right? It's revoked. What about this example?
Bob, I've got way more firewood than I need this year. I'll sell you 2 cords for $300.
I might be interested. Let me think about it. I'll let you know on Wednesday. So there, Bob hasn't accepted, right? He's equivocating, saying he wants to think about it, and he's saying, I'll let you know on Wednesday. Well,
really? You're that indecisive? Okay, I'll look to hear from you on Wednesday.
But again, remember, this is gratuitous. Him saying, I'll wait till Wednesday. It's now just Tuesday afternoon. Bob, I heard you were thinking about buying firewood from Bo. The thing is, Bo sold it all this morning to someone else. So remember, the notice doesn't have to come directly from Bo. It can come through a third party here, like Herman. And so if this is, assuming he is trustworthy, then that notice is fine. That's a revocation, right? It's prior to when Bob accepted, and there's been notice given, albeit through Herman. That's fine. What about example 3? Herman, you have something that I want. In a moment, it will be mine. That is if you'll sell it to me. I will buy your plush Baby Yoda for $60. I'm trying to find one for Barb for Christmas, but they're out of stock everywhere. Will you please, Herman? Come on, pretty please. Yikes, a bit aggressive, eh? I'll think about it. I'm pretty fond of my Baby Yoda. So the next day, oh, hey, Herman, I'm not sure I'm interested in your Baby Yoda anymore. Barb and I had a falling out after a mishap with my lightsaber. So there, keep in mind what happens, that it's prior. Bob made an offer to buy Herman's Baby Yoda for $60. Herman made a very equivocal statement. He didn't accept it, right? It was just an equivocal statement. He didn't accept, and then Bob's coming back and revoking. He's giving direct notice to Herman. That would be an effective revocation because it's prior to Herman actually accepting, and there's here direct notice is given. So it's a revocation. Let's look at example 4.
Bobby, my main man, I'm moving to go to law school. I know you've been looking for a bigger place. I will sell you my one-of-a-kind tremendous house for $200,000.
You're right. I have been looking for a bigger place. I do like your place, but it smells like a locker room. I don't know, Bo.
All right. I'll tell you what, Bobby. I'll give you 2 days to think about it. And then you let the old Bo know, capiche?
Yep, sounds good, Bo. So the next day, right, he said, keep in mind, he says, I'll give you 2 days. And so it's only been 1 day, right? It says the next day.
So the place is all yours, Herman. Nice doing business with you. I appreciate it.
So here, this is a situation where the notice is indirect, right? You have Bob over there hearing this, seeing the conduct that's going on, that Herman and Bo are agreeing that he's going to sell the place to Herman. That is sufficient notice that he's aware that Bo is selling it to somebody else. And remember, Bo's promise to keep it open for 2 days was merely gratuitous. There's no option contract or anything that would make the offer irrevocable for any period of time because it's just a gratuitous promise. And so Bo's not bound by it. This would be another revocation. It would be effective. And so we've looked at rejection, which is pretty straightforward. But remember, rejection comes from the offeree. We looked at revocation, which comes from the offeror. And the notice can be direct or indirect. And now we're looking at a counteroffer, which comes from the offeree. It comes from the offeree. So an offeree, here's what it says. They make a counteroffer when she rejects the original offer and replaces it with a new offer, and it's effective upon notice to the offeror. So a counteroffer is two things. It's both a rejection of the original offer or of an offer, and then making a new offer. And here, we're going to look at some of these exceptions. Here it says that if there's a counteroffer, you could have an offer where somebody says, I will consider counteroffers, but my offer is going to stay alive. We'll talk about that and see some examples of that in a second. So let's look at example 1. Bo, I'm looking to make some money. I will wash your car this afternoon if you will pay me $25.
I'd love to have my car washed. I'll pay you $20 to do it.
So he's changed the price, right? And we looked at that before and said it's not an acceptance. But not only is it not an acceptance, it's a counteroffer, right? He's rejecting, even though he sounds like he's agreeing, what he's actually doing is rejecting Bob's offer to do it for 25 and making a new offer, right? He's saying not 25, but actually 20. So there's a counteroffer that Bo's making. So not only is that not an acceptance, it's a counteroffer because it's a rejection of Bob's offer and the making of a new offer. So here, what about this example? Bo, I'm looking to make some money. I will wash your car this afternoon if you'll pay me $25.
I accept, provided you also agree to wash my van as part of the deal.
So again, he's sounding like he's accepting, but he's saying, I want you to also do this thing. It's what we would term a conditional acceptance. He's expressly conditioning his acceptance on Bob agreeing to also wash his van. That is not an acceptance. It's a counteroffer. He's actually rejecting the offer as laid out, the terms as laid out by Bob in his offer, and making a new offer, which is to say, for the $25, I want you to wash my car, but also my van. So that is a counteroffer. Example 3. Bo, I'm looking to make some money. I will wash your car this afternoon if you'll pay me $25.
Let me keep that under consideration, Bob. Would you consider also washing me van if I pay you $35?
So here, the key difference between this and everything else, right? He's got some piratey talk in there, I guess, this time. But as we're thinking about this, one key thing to know is he's saying, I'm not rejecting, let me keep that under consideration, right? So he's not making a counteroffer because a counteroffer is a clear rejection and a new offer. He's saying, let me think about it, I'll keep it in mind, and then making an inquiry, which is to say, if I pay you an extra $10, would you also wash my van, right? Because so remember, Bob said 25 for the car, and he's saying, if I pay you 10 more, might you also do my van? So that's what we call a mere inquiry, because it's not a counteroffer. He's keeping the original offer alive and just making an inquiry with Bob about a possible change to the deal. So at that point, it's just what we call mere inquiry. So what about this? Bo, I'm looking to make some money. I will wash your car this afternoon if you'll pay me $25.
Any chance you might be willing to come down in the price a bit?
So here, this is while he's not saying, well, let me keep your offer under consideration. He's not specifically trying to preserve Bob's offer. But what is clear from this is that he's not making a new offer, right? Because you would have to say, okay, is he rejecting? Maybe that part's ambiguous, but it's clearly not a new offer, so it still can't be a counteroffer, right? Because if it were a counteroffer, what would the price be? If you just say come down in the price a bit, that could be all the way down to 1 cent, but all the way up to $24.99, right? So it's not certain and definite enough to be a new offer. It's again just an inquiry, right? He's not clearly rejecting the offer, and he's not clearly making a new offer. He's just kind of asking Bob a question, exploring possibilities. So it's again a mere inquiry. What about this? Bo, I'm looking to make some money. What do you think about paying me $25 to wash your car? I'll keep my offer open for the next 3 days. In the meantime, I'm happy to entertain your counteroffers. So this is viewed certain ways. As I was giving the definition of a counteroffer, often this is viewed as the offeror has set and established that for 3 days, I'm going to keep this open and I will entertain counteroffers. Now, often this would be done explicitly with some sort of option and not just this way, but as it's set up, this works, right? So if Bo says,
Okay, how about I pay you $35 and you wash both my car and my van?
So ordinarily, absent this language, that counteroffer would kill Bob's offer, right? But in this case, he specifically preserved it and said, I'll entertain your counteroffer. So either you will see people refer to this different ways. Either they'll say, well, effectively all Bob's done is said, you can make inquiries to me about other possibilities. Or you could say, well, no, what's actually going on is that Bob's saying your counteroffers are not going to terminate the power of acceptance here, right? That Bo will still have the power to accept, because if it's a counteroffer, remember that would terminate Bo's power of acceptance and switch things around. Now it would be Bo's the offeror, Bob's the offeree, and now the power of acceptance passes to Bob instead of Bo. So now, we've done rejection, revocation, counteroffer. Let's jump to lapse. Lapse is that when we're looking at sort of how long does an offer lapse? If there's no acceptance, how long does it lapse? If nothing happens to it, right? If an offer's just hanging out there, how long does it hang out there? And the key here is if there's a time that is specified, then it will lapse at that specified time. If there's no time specified, then it will end at the reasonable time, which depends on all the facts and the circumstances. So let's look again at some examples.
Bob, I've decided I'm finished with traveling. I will sell you my RV for $65,000. Are you interested? I'll keep my offer open until 5 p.m. on Friday.
So here, this is really important to understand. We talked about how this kind of thing is gratuitous, meaning that Bo could revoke if he wants to, but he's not required to revoke, right? He could, if he doesn't revoke, the offer's just going to be hanging out there, but it will lapse at 5 p.m. on Friday. So here's what Bob says. That's an interesting idea. I might be interested. I'll think about it and get back to you soon. Thanks for the offer. So now, remember, he had till 5 p.m. on Friday, and he's coming at 6:08. I'm interested, Bo. I'll take the RV for $65,000. So keep in mind, Bo didn't revoke. There was nothing else that occurred. There was no rejection. There was no counteroffer. So this offer's still hanging out there. But the thing is, Bo specified a time. It died at 5 p.m. on Friday. It's after 5 p.m. So it lapsed at 5 p.m.
Really, Bob? It's after 5 p.m. on Friday.
So Bo's offer lapsed, right? That's the thing to understand. But also understanding the difference between having the power of revocation and not, and how lapse interacts with that. Indeed, Bob is now the one who made an offer, right? Because the offer died when Bob comes back and says, I'll buy it for $65,000. Bo's offer is gone, so Bob would now be the one who made the offer, right? So they've switched roles here, not in terms of a counteroffer, but it's just because Bo's offer lapsed. So example 2.
Bob, I decided I'm finished with traveling. I'll sell you my RV for $65,000. I have a number of offers already, but I prefer to sell to you since you're my good friend. Just let me know soon. I need to sell it quickly.
So Bo's saying he didn't specify a time, but it's clear from the facts and the circumstances, the fact that he otherwise has other offers, he's saying, I need to know soon, I want to sell quickly, that he's got to move quickly, that there's a short amount of time, it's going to lapse very quickly. That's an intriguing idea. I might be interested. I'll think about it and get back to you. Thanks for thinking of me. So he waits an entire week, and in that case, it's going to have lapsed, right? Because he was saying, I need to know right away. I'm interested, Bo. I'll take the RV for $65,000.
Really, Bob? What part of soon did you not get?
So Bo's offer lapsed, right? If we look at all the surrounding facts and circumstances, again, there were other offers. He said he needed to act quickly, et cetera, et cetera. Waiting a week was waiting too long. So it lapsed. So there was no specified time period for how long the offer would lapse, but it's for a reasonable time, and the facts and the circumstances suggest it needed to be soon and quick. So there, let's look at example 3.
Bob, I've decided I'm finished with traveling. I'm going to sell my RV. No real hurry, but if you're interested, I'll sell it to you for $65,000. Let me know what you think.
So here it's the opposite, right? He's saying there's no hurry. Basically get back to me when you do. There's no specified time period. So Bob says, that's an interesting idea. I might be interested. I want to run the idea past a few people first, and then I'll let you know. So a month passes. That may be okay under the circumstances, right? He says, there's no hurry, basically get back to me. So it may be reasonable, right? There's nothing, RVs aren't like bananas. They don't spoil. They sit around. They're fine. There's no indication that a month is too long under these facts and circumstances. So when Bob goes, I'm interested, Bo, I'll take the RV for $65,000, it's likely that Bo's offer has not lapsed here.
Finally, I thought I'd never hear from you.
So Bob probably accepted Bo's offer that Bo's offer didn't lapse. It would depend on the facts and the circumstances. I could see in certain circumstances maybe a month would be too long, but there were no particular facts that suggested it was too long in this case. Let's look at example 4.
Bob, I've got way too many bananas. My banana plants have grown like crazy. I will sell you 2 bags of them for $15.
Okay, sounds good. I'll check with Barb and get back to you. He waits a week. Bob, I'd love to buy 2 bags of bananas from you for $15.
You do know bananas don't last very long, right?
Because so here, there's no specified time period, but by the nature of bananas, that they're produce, they go bad, that waiting 2 weeks is not going to work, right? So the offer lapsed. It's been more than a reasonable period of time. So that was lapse. Let's look at what happens if one of the parties dies. The general rule is that the power of acceptance will be destroyed or terminated if either of the parties dies. So if either the offeror or the offeree dies, then the power of acceptance is terminated. However, if they already have a contract, if there's already agreement, then the contract will survive the death of either of the parties. So let's look at examples here. Bo, I'll mow your lawn on Friday at 3 p.m. if you pay me $30. So here, Bo dies, right? So in that case, before there was any acceptance, so the offeree died here, and that terminated the offer because it terminated the power of acceptance, right? So the offer is gone. What about example 2? Bo, I'll mow your lawn on Friday at 3 p.m. if you'll pay me $30. And this time the offeror dies. And in this case, right, you look at this and say, same effect. Doesn't matter which party dies. If there's no acceptance, then the offer's terminated, there is the power of acceptance is gone. Bo doesn't have it anymore. What about example 3? Bo, I'll mow your lawn on Friday at 3 p.m. if you'll pay me $30.
That would be great. Thanks, Bob. By the way, what's up there? Well, what are you looking for?
So here, Bo accepted and then he died. And it will survive his death, right? It will survive his death. And so the contract survives. This isn't an issue. The power, it had already been accepted, right? So there's no concern about the power of acceptance terminating or the offer being terminated. So that's termination by rejection, revocation, counteroffer, lapse, and death. So there's a lot there. What about silence as acceptance? So what's our general rule and the exceptions? The general rule is that silence, that the offeree's silence is not normally treated as acceptance, but there are 3 exceptions. So one is if the offeree agrees that the offeree's silence should be treated as acceptance, or if they have a pattern of dealing, right, that they have a pattern of past dealing, then that establishes that their silence should be treated as acceptance, then it will be. And then if the offeree exerts control over what the offeror has given as consideration, then that will be deemed to be acceptance, even though they were silent. The offeree was silent. So let's look at some examples of that. So let's hear. Bo, I'll sell you my Toyota Corolla for $1 million. If you don't say no in 3 seconds, you agree to buy it. 3, 2, 1, sold. That doesn't work, right? Because that's the normal rule. There's no agreement to that by Bo, right? It doesn't fall within any of the acceptance or the exceptions that Bo hasn't agreed that his silence is acceptance. This isn't a situation where we're given that, oh, they have this past dealings, a history of dealing that we can look at to say that, well, the silence here should be treated as acceptance, or that Bo has exerted any control over the Toyota Corolla that Bob is offering here. So this is just doesn't work. And this also hopefully drives home to you why we normally say this kind of thing doesn't work, because we don't want offerees to be forced into acceptance, even though we say that an offeror is the master of his or her offer. There has to be agreement. So here, Bo's silence was not acceptance. Example 2, Bo, have I got a deal for you? Join my Book of the Month Club. Every month, I will mail you Bob's book club selection for that month. If you keep it, you pay me the cost of the book. If you decide it's not for you, you can send it back to me using the prepaid USPS label. Are you in?
Sure, that sounds like fun.
So here, Bo is agreeing to this arrangement, right? So this sounds like it's headed towards the first exception, which is where the parties, the offeree, is agreeing that their silence is acceptance. So here we have Bo getting the book.
Surprise, surprise, the book actually looks pretty good.
So 2 weeks later, he still has the book, he's reading it, and he's already agreed that here he's silent, he's reading the book, but he's accepted by his silence because he's agreed that if I keep the book, if I'm silent, that will be acceptance. So this is common with things like Book of the Month clubs, or in the past, in the 90s, you had music, CD clubs, things like that, BMG, things like that, where those things happen, right? That if you don't, you agree on the front end when you sign up that your silence is acceptance, and that's what occurred here. So what about example 3? It says, for the past 6 summers, Bob has mowed Bo's lawn. Bob comes every week to mow the lawn unless Bo calls him the week before and tells him not to come the following week. That is, until this summer. So they have this pattern of dealing, of past dealing here. And so Bob comes, he mows the lawn, and now Bo's saying,
Bob, I received your invoice for mowing my lawn last week. I didn't want you to mow my lawn. I'm not paying.
But they had agreed, or not agreed, but they had this pattern, this history of dealing with one another, where Bob would just come and mow the lawn, and he would only not come if Bo told him not to. And so Bo's trying to say, well, I was silent, but I didn't accept. Well, because of the way they'd work for summer after summer after summer, his silence be deemed acceptance here. It's because they have this history of dealing. So what about this example?
Bob, I'm starting a meal service. I plan to start making meals each week and delivering them to people. Check out my brochure.
Whoa, Bo, it looks great. So week 1, Bo comes, he delivers a meal, he leaves it there, and Bob's munching, nom, 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 nom. Week 2, he delivers another meal, nom, 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 nom. Week 3, he delivers another meal, right? He's delivering it, he's leaving it there on the front porch, and you get nom, 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 nom. And week 4, he finally sees Bob.
Hey, there you are. Are you ever going to pay me for all the meals I've been delivering to you?
And in this case, you have silence, right? His silence is he's exerting control. He knows that Bo's delivering these meals. He's exerting control over them, even though he never officially signed up. But Bo is delivering the meals, and Bob is just accepting them in exerting control by eating them and not saying anything, speaking up. So, no, I didn't accept the meals in the first place. You just started leaving them at my door. So in this case, it's likely that Bob's silence was acceptance. There might be room to argue that, he's basically being the equivalent of a officious intermeddler kind of thing. But in this case, he knows where they're coming from. He's accepting them. He's eating them. It's likely that his silence, as far as communicating to Bo, would be deemed acceptance because he's exerting control over the consideration that Bo is providing, which are the meals. So the mailbox rule is sort of the last thing here. And I know this is really long, but let's keep plugging along. So the mailbox rule applies to where we're going to look at it. In particular, we're talking about acceptances here. And the rule is that when sent through the mail, an acceptance is effective on dispatch, meaning when it's put into the mail. And everything else, an offer, a rejection, a counteroffer, a revocation, is effective on receipt by the other party, on receipt. So let's look at a bunch of examples here. So Herman is putting something in the mail, and Bob gets it. You may rent my beach house this summer for $1,200 a month. Your friend Herman. So Bob received this. This is an offer from Herman. And remember our rule that everything but an acceptance is good on receipt. So Herman's offer is good on receipt by Bob. And then Bob is putting his acceptance in the mail. Now, I hope Herman gets my acceptance letter soon enough. So he's thinking that in his head. He's putting it in there. Bob's acceptance is good on dispatch, right? So that's basic mailbox rule, that it's good as soon as he puts it in the mail and it's out of his control. The mail truck comes, picks it up. So example 2, let's look at another possibility. Herman putting his flag up, putting his letter in there again, and here's something key to know here. It's a slightly different. Bob gets this out of his mailbox and says, and is thinking in his head, it's from Herman. Maybe I'll open it later, not now. So it doesn't matter that he didn't open it. We said that the mailbox rule says that our rule here with an offer is that it's good on receipt, and that's true even if the offeree here, Bob, doesn't open it. It's still considered to have been received, and Bob would be considered to have notice of the offer. So the next day, he opens it, but keep in mind the offer was already effective. He already had the power of acceptance. You may rent my beach house this summer for $1,200 a month. Your friend, Herman. I think I'm interested. I'll mail my acceptance letter at least. So Bob puts an acceptance letter in his mailbox, and later that same day, he changes his mind. I wish I hadn't accepted. I don't have the money. Hopefully my rejection will get to Herman first. So the order here is he mails an acceptance, then he turns around and mails a rejection. And this is the thing to know that is the order. When the offeree first mails an acceptance, then turns around and mails the rejection is just ignored. The acceptance is good on dispatch. The basic mailbox rule applies. We say the acceptance was good on dispatch. But you need to think about, isn't there another possibility that creates problems here though, right? So if we start into this again, Herman's mailing his offer, Bob gets it. You may rent my beach house this summer for $1,200 a month. Your friend Herman. So he receives it. It's good on receipt. So he has the power of acceptance. He again first mails his acceptance. I think I'm interested. I'll mail my acceptance letter at least. And then the same day he turns around and mails his rejection. I wish I hadn't accepted. I don't have the money. Hopefully my rejection will get to Herman first. So what happens here? He mails, we said the general rule is that the acceptance is good on dispatch. This is all up to this point exactly what we said. But what if this happens, that rather than the acceptance getting there first, Herman receives the rejection? Herman, sorry, I don't have money this year to rent the beach house. Love, Bob. So even though the Bob sent the acceptance first, then the rejection, and ordinarily we'd say, well, the mailbox rule applies and the acceptance was good on dispatch. In this case, there's this unfairness, right? Because remember, Herman has no knowledge that Bob sent the acceptance and he received the rejection first. So he's got the rejection. Now, if that's all that occurred, it would be fine. But if we add this, right, if we say, okay, he's unaware of this, if Herman didn't do anything, then we would just do what we did in our previous example. We would say, well, eventually the acceptance is going to come. He would know that it was accepted, and the acceptance would control over the rejection because it was mailed first. But what if here, where Herman gets the rejection first, he relies on it? He goes to Bo and says, Bob, my beach house is still available to rent this summer if you're interested. It's $1,200 a month.
That sounds great. Count me in.
So he's relied on it. Now, assuming that Bob isn't interested, he's rented it out to Herman's rented it out to Bo. So this is a situation where Herman's relied on the rejection. And so we've got to look at this and say, okay, now the acceptance shows up, and that's what Bob is wanting, right? Or it's ordinarily we'd say, well, that controls. So what happens where he's detrimentally relied? And here, we will say that if Bob can't try to insist that, the mailbox rule should control in this case because of the fact that Herman happened to receive the rejection first and then relied on it, then Bob can't assert the mailbox rule and claim that he had a contract upon dispatch because of the reliance, okay? Now, there's another variation of this, of course, which is we were looking at the sequence of acceptance first, then rejection, and we said the mailbox rule control unless if Herman happened to receive the rejection first and then detrimentally relied on it, then we'd say no, the mailbox rule wouldn't work. But what if it's the opposite, that the rejection is mailed first, then the acceptance? How do we do that? So the offer here, Herman makes his offer. You may rent my beach house this summer for $1,200 a month. Your friend, Herman. So again, Herman's offer is good on receipt by Bob. Sorry, buddy, I have to say no, not enough money this year. Bob's rejection, remember, is normally not effective until received by Herman. The only thing good on dispatch is typically the acceptance. Later that same day, so the rejection is mailed first, and then Bob changes his mind and realizes, oh, maybe I can. And so he mails out his acceptance. I actually think I can afford it. I'll mail my acceptance and hope Herman gets it. So 3 days later, here's what happens. There's two possibilities, right? One would be that the rejection gets there first. Herman, sorry, I don't have the money this year to rent the beach house. Love, Bob. So if the rejection gets here first, if the order, rather than being acceptance then rejection, if the order is rejection then acceptance, it's a race to see which one gets there first. In this first possibility, we said the rejection gets there first, then that means Bob has rejected Herman's offer. But the other possibility, of course, is that the acceptance gets there first. Herman, absolutely, I'd love to rent the beach house this summer. Please ignore my rejection letter. Love, Bob. So here, again, if it's rejection, then acceptance, if that's the order coming from the offeree, mailbox rule doesn't apply. It's a race to see which one gets there first. Here it's the acceptance. The acceptance is effective when received by Herman. So there would be a contract, there would be acceptance of the offer. So there are some exceptions generally to the mailbox rule beyond the ones we were looking at, which is always, there can be an agreement, or even the offeror can say that in their offer that the mailbox rule does not control, right? That the acceptance is only good upon receipt by the offeror. Here, sometimes that's phrased as the parties agree that acceptance is not effective until receipt, but often that, if that's going to occur, the reason the offeree is agreeing to that is because the offeror has actually laid that out in their offer. And the other possibility is if the parties have an option contract where they've agreed that an offer will be held open for a period of time in exchange for some amount of consideration, then the acceptance is not good until received. And the theory there, and we'll talk about this more in another lesson, actually in the next lesson. The theory here, though, is that if we didn't do this, then it would effectively lengthen the option period, right? Because the offeror would have to wait around and say, well, it could be that the offeree put an acceptance in the mail on the last day of the option period, and I don't know, so I've got to wait another 3 days, 5 days a week just to make sure. And so to prevent that kind of thing, we say, no, if there's an option, it has to be received within the option period. That way, when the option period closes, if it hasn't been received within that window, then there is no acceptance. Then if you're dealing with the federal government, the rule is always that they're not bound by the mailbox rule, and it's only effective upon receipt. So I know that's a lot. There's a lot there, and I hope it's helpful. There's a lot of nitpicky rules in here, but thank you so much for listening, for watching. I hope you liked it. If you did, give me the old thumbs up, and please subscribe if you haven't already. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with more in the coming week. Talk to you soon.